it's a all right. Well, here we are again. It's a big turnout. Can't even. Oh, there we go. So today we're doing Lucian of. Oh my God, I should have written this down, shouldn't I? Lucian of Samosata.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct? Yes.
Yeah.
I looked it up. I think he was born around 120 AD. Does that
Yeah.
sound
So he's an
correct?
exact contemporary of Marcus Aurelius, basically.
Yes. And he's a satirist. And it seems he's writing, it's kind of a skeptical piece, isn't it? He seems to favor the skeptical approach here. Um, so I'll just read this little bit here. It says Lucian in the character of Lacinus. Is that how you would say that? Maybe?
That's more accurate. I think we tend to say Lycinus, but
Oh,
but
okay.
just to note, that is kind of a variant of his own name. So pretty obviously, he's
Oh,
identifying himself with Lycinus.
okay. Okay, like Lacinus or Lycinus, which he assumes in this dialogue, laughs at the various sects of philosophers, rallies at their absurdities, condemns their partial attachments to their own tenets, and exposes their pride and self-sufficiency. His irony is delicate, his illusions ingenious, sorry, and most of his arguments in favor of this, I must have missed a word there, in favor of the skepticism which he supports, unanswerable. A vein of something. Unfortunately, I can't see the screen. Hang on. A vein of, oh no, I can, of good
Good
sense
sense and close reasoning.
runs
Yeah.
through the whole. The style is clear, flowing, and transparent. Um, yeah, so it's called Hermotimus, or On the Rival Philosophies, I think is what it's called, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um, and I read just briefly on the wiki page that Lucian is making a parody of the Socratic dialectical style. Um, it actually said that he'd in nah, I can't remember exactly, but that's a claim they make on Wikipedia, whether that's true or not. But you do definitely get a sense of the dialogues when you're reading along, and I think it is helpful to think of it as a satire or a parody because although the arguments can be a little bit persuasive at times, they're quite extreme. They're exaggerated. Did you find that?
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. And I suppose what struck me is that throughout the dialogue, Lucian makes a number of arguments, um, and I guess that's also reminiscent of a Platonic dialogue, right? Because there's a number of ways of attack, I guess. So there's the argument around the fact that virtue takes such a long time to
Yeah.
acquire that basically you need several lifetimes in it if you're going to pursue it. There's the argument, and we see this in a couple of different aspects, that the study of virtue doesn't seem to make either the teacher or his students better people. So first of all, we get a pretty damning sketch of Hermotimus's teacher, who's never named, in his behaviour. And then later on, we get an even more damning sketch of one of his students. So that's one of the arguments used. And then there's I think probably what takes up the most time in the dialogue is the argument that, well, how do you actually choose the best philosophical school, particularly if you haven't tried them all?
Mm.
And just as a kind of a intertext, if you like, or comparator, around this very same period, we have the Christian writer Justin, who was martyred, so he's known as Justin Martyr. But around this very same period, he writes in the dialogue or letter, I can't remember if it's a dialogue or a letter, I think it's a dialogue with Tryphon, about his own experience trying out all the philosophical schools. So he starts with a Platonist, then he goes to a Pythagorean or an Aristotelian, and a Stoic, and he finds them all wanting in a number of ways. And then if finally he is converted to Christianity, and Christianity is placed in this kind of context, I guess. So this kind of this idea of trying out the different schools is something that Lucian addresses in some other dialogues as well, but it was obviously something that was in culture around the same time.
Well, that's really interesting. And I guess to set the scene too, it's Hermotimus walking down the street. He's on his way to the lecture, and he gets intercepted by Lycaenus. And I think this setup's kind of interesting because as we go along, we find out that Hermotimus has kind of sacrificed most of his life to going and sitting around philosophy lectures and reading and trying to put this stuff into practice. And I guess this is a thing that makes the argument a little bit strange if it's a critique of Stoicism, is that it's a critique of Stoicism partially insofar as it requires a person to become a permanent student in the manner that Hermotimus is. So I don't know my history well enough, but I guess if there was a problem in society at that time where well-to-do men were throwing away all their free time instead of being active in political life or whatever, but instead had eschewed that and were constantly, well, just obsessively focused on this pursuit of virtue, then his kind of criticisms make a lot of sense. But I'm getting the sense that that's probably very exaggerated, and the reality is obviously that very few Stoics would have taken up that kind of interpretation that Hermotimus seems to have. But then again, it could equally be a good criticism of what academics do today, for example. What do you think around those ideas?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And yeah, I think you're right. I think much more normal was the model of someone like Arrian, who went along to Epictetus's lectures, but then he went on to his career in the military and administration. That was more typical of the philosophical student. It was a necessary preparation, but it wasn't the be all and end all. So yeah, I think you're right that this was possibly a little bit out of the ordinary.
And one thing that turned me on to this particular reading was an academic person that we both know in common made a comment on his LinkedIn, I think, about this text, saying that philosophy students should definitely read this before they graduate. And having now read it, I think, oh yes, it makes a lot of sense if you're going on to consider postgraduate studies or a career in philosophy. Yeah, that this would be maybe a useful text in helping you consider like what you think philosophy might actually be. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it kind of addresses the whole issue around philosophy as a way of life. Is it going to be, is it a means to an end, or is it an end in itself? I think is the fundamental question that the dialogue asks.
and one thing it asks, uh, which is probably important to preface, is how far do we go with this notion that um, virtue is the be all and end all of the philosophical way of life? Because that comes up quite a lot, it's there's this sense in some of the more orthodox readings, I guess, that or traditional, that only the wise man is truly virtuous and everybody else is full of vice. But then you get a more, I'd say, what do you call it, moderate reading through Epictetus and those sort of Stoics who would kind of disregard that and probably say, why are we so hyper focused on virtue as the end stage? Yeah, it might be the only good, but it's kind of an abstract goal that and we have no choice really but to grow and to develop along these lines towards something, towards some kind of worthwhile, ultimate goal. Um, and that, this kind of focus on some sort of becoming a sage or becoming the man of virtue maybe that's not what it's about entirely
Mm,
or at all.
yeah, yeah,
Mm.
exactly. But yeah, I think those are fundamental questions that were front and center. I mean, even in the life of Marcus Aurelius. So there's this story that quite relatively late in his life. So I'd say it's probably when he was maybe in his 50s already. There's a story that he went to the lectures of uh, Sextus, the nephew of Plutarch, who was and Marcus mentions Sextus in Meditations as one of his teachers. But yeah, we find out from one of the biographers that was late in his life, and that was regarded as quite well, there's a story of him being laughed at about it because, well, hang on, haven't you got a real job as the emperor, and here you are. And the point was made, Alexander the Great had conquered the world by 30 something, and here's our emperor going to listen to a philosopher when he's in his old age. So I think it was quite a sensitive cultural issue, and so yeah, I think Lucian was putting his finger on something important at the time.
Yeah, and I mean, even from a modern perspective, it's a real, what's the word? There's a strong temptation for anybody who gets involved in religion or spirituality to feel like they have this mountain to climb, that they have
Mm.
to devote themselves to it 100% or otherwise, um, yeah, I don't know, not really
Or
sure
they're
how
not
I can,
serious, or yeah,
yeah.
it's a kind of a test of commitment
Mm.
or yeah, dedication,
And it can be really
seriousness.
demoralizing. Like, what if you're a young man and you still feel attracted to, an attractive woman, for example, or male or whatever? You feel like perhaps if you're young and you're impressionable, that you haven't made the kind of progress that you ought to have, and to have those messages in philosophy, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't really know. I just think it's something that it's interesting to kind of contemplate because as an older person, I feel like I can kind of put that aside and like, well, I just enjoy
Yeah,
it as a lifestyle
exactly.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. I think we're differently placed from a young person.
Yeah.
Uh,
But we
yeah,
should jump into it. Okay. So
sure.
obviously he's walking down the street and he gets bailed up by Licinus, and
Yeah, and he's kind of impatient at first, isn't he? He just wants to get to his lecture. It's like, can we? But yeah, and Lycinus is quite persistent in his in his questioning, and I thought it's pretty funny, right? When he says, so when exactly are you going to get to the top of this mountain, right? Is it going to be after the mysteries or the Panathenaea or maybe the next Olympiad? It's like, well, what's the time frame here?
yeah.
Um, but it turns out that Hermotimus doesn't really have a time frame. Uh, in fact, he's kind of rejected that in a way. He says, um, yeah, he says he's only starting out, as it says in section 2 there.
Yeah.
Uh,
He's
and
only
he
just
and
beginning,
it,
yeah, just
yeah,
beginning to get an inkling of the right way.
yeah, that's right. And so Lycinus tries to commit him to, well, are you halfway there? Well, the
Mhm.
gut is half done. No, no.
And he really badgers him about this. Where shall we put you then?
And he's kind of really being quite troublesome about it, isn't he? He's really focusing on this point about the time frames.
Yeah. And that's an important theme as we go along. And then he uses this interesting image of, well, why doesn't your master just pull you up with his rope from his station on the summit?
That's right. Yeah, this is an image that Lucian actually used a lot. I was reading some of the other works in this blurb, and yeah, it's a famous image in Homer of Zeus holding everything on a rope. Um, and yeah, Lucian seems quite fond of this image.
It's an interesting point, isn't it? Because you think, well, if if we're meant to strive towards virtue, and there's these kind of I don't know, ideal people who've come before us, or even godlike beings that at the end of the road, how come there isn't something like a pull or a gravity or something that draws the dedicated student along? I guess, that would seem to be appropriate if it was the right path, but that's obviously lacking.
Well, that's right. You'd think there'd be way markers or something. If we've got this image of a road, right? A road has way markers or towns along the route, places you stop and reflect. But here there doesn't seem to be any of that.
Yeah, and that's a good image. Like, if other people had gone before, why haven't they scratched something on the side of the road? Like, yeah, you're doing well, brother. It's just a
And
little bit up ahead.
here we see at the end of section 5, Alexander is actually used as um, a, a sort of an example, uh, how much higher and more slippery praise the peak on which your virtue dwells, and that enormous crag which Alexander stormed in a few days. So this is one very famous episode where Alexander and his troops sailed this massive rock. They used ropes to climb it. It was an incredible feat. So there's this image of great effort and achievement, but he's not. Yeah, Hermotimus really he rejects that kind of analogy. It's
Mm.
not like that, he says.
Yeah, and it's got this kind of I don't know whether you would call it like the view from above, or whether it's more of just this lofty kind of almost arrogance. Those who
Oh, I think it is.
endure.
I think it's definitely a reference to Stoic view from above. I think looking down from their height upon the ants, which are the rest of mankind, and that's a pretty negative take
Yeah.
on the view from above. But it's also, well, maybe it's almost yeah, it's maybe if we are, looking towards the Stoic path ourselves, maybe we need to accept a fairly negative take on it.
Mm.
So yeah,
And like Highness is taking it that way. He says,
yeah.
"Dear me, what tiny things you make us out. Not so big as the pygmies even, but positively groveling on the face of the earth." So he's
That's
really
right.
honing in on that. You guys think you're pretty good, don't you? And,
And it just he does say at the end of the dialogue, remember, he does say, look, I'm not picking on Stoicism particularly, but I think he actually is.
yeah. And we, the common men that walk the earth, shall mingle you with the gods in our prayers, for you are translated above the clouds and gone up whither you have so long striven. And
And of
he's
course, Hermotimus doesn't see that Licinius is having a laugh here, right? He takes it
yeah,
seriously.
not yet. Not yet. But there seems to be like a bit where he gets to where he's like, "Oh, come on, you're just being a dick now."
That's right.
This one would actually go well as a kind of like a bit like the clouds as a play, where
Yeah,
you can imagine Hamatemus kind of catching on that this is actually not a friendly stroll, but he gets quite harassed, really, doesn't he?
he sure does. I actually was reminded of the clouds as well, because that was another, student kind of relationship, a student who's somehow maybe not doing it for the right reason. So
Mm.
we'll have to see. Yeah.
All right, so he won't answer the question about time. This is in 6. And then what does he say? He says, well, 20 years. Have you, your master's promised that you will live so long? Okay, so even if it takes ages, how do you know you're going to live long enough to actually benefit? And then Hamatina says, well, these are evil words. Um, like Highness, may life be granted me that I may grow wise and have if it be but one day of happiness. So he's going to go through all this, even if he can have one day of real happiness. Um, so he'll be content, but just for the briefest moment, perhaps, and that will be good enough.
But of course, Lycinus isn't very impressed by that. He wants to pin that down. Well, what's this happiness like? Is it worth everything? How can you tell? You haven't been up there.
Yeah.
And then it comes to the point, well, I trust my master's word. That's what Hermotimus is doing. He's trusting his teacher.
And what are the good things he offers to those who carry their course? And of course, Hermotimus gives the classic ones: wisdom, courage, beauty, justice, all the virtues. and he's going to abandon wealth and glory and pleasure and all the bodily things. These a man strips off and abandons before he mounts up, like Heracles burning on Mount Oeta before deification. And then, of
Yeah, he
course,
kind of, and so he's kind of almost identifying himself with a great hero, and alignment with the gods is what he seeks.
yeah, yeah. And that's interesting. I mean, you don't really see much of that in the Stoics that we read today. That's
You see a bit of in Seneca, I have to say. He's
okay.
often talking about becoming equal to the gods. So yeah, I think it
Okay.
was definitely a theme.
Yeah, okay. It's yeah, like here, he too cast off whatever of the human he had from his mother and soared up to the gods with his divine part, pure and unalloyed, sifted by the fire. Fair enough. It's a purification, as they say, purification by philosophical fire. Um, and so what does I keep forgetting his name, Lakinus say? There is one thing I should like to know. Are they allowed to come down from their elevation sometime? Good question. Once they become all virtuous in that, can they come down and have a bit of fun sometimes?
No, and question no, Hermotimus denies that.
Yeah, because he'll never be subject to those sort of earthly desires anymore, will he? And no longer feel pain, nor any such sensation. I wonder what the Greek says there. Would it be
Oh, hang on, I
sensation
can tell
or
you. Hang on. What that's it in, is that, so can you just go up to the what number is it?
eight?
It's 8. Okay. Um,
See, again, it's very extreme because we're saying here he doesn't feel pain, which,
okay, yes, it's so ude lo poito, ude holos patot etitoioton patoian. Pathos, he won't experience any pathos, any
yeah.
emotion.
So that's a bit different from sensation. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, that makes more sense. Remember, I think this translation's from 1902 or something, by the way. Okay. If one might dare to say what one thinks, but no, let me keep a good tongue in my head, it were irreverent to pry into what wise men do. So here, like, kindness is baiting him. He's like, I kind of want to tell you what I'm thinking, but you're wiser than me, so maybe it's a good idea for me to keep my mouth shut. And Hermotinus said, no, I want to know what you're thinking. Come on, fat friend, tell me what, we're all by ourselves, let me know. And then Lakinus, what does he say?
Yeah, he Hermotimus takes the bait, and like Lycinus comes out with this story about the professor, Hermotimus's teacher, who's never named, as I said. But yeah, what happens is, well, this teacher had a student, Dion, the red-haired one, who hadn't paid his fees, and the old man hailed him before the magistrate. He was shouting and fuming, and if others had not come up and got the young man out of his hands, he would have bitten off his nose. He was in such a temper. And so what does Hermotimus do? Blame the student, right?
Yeah.
For not having paid up his debt to the teacher.
Yeah, because he has
Just
to
on
care
that
for his
too.
children.
That's right. In Justin's account too of trying all the different schools out, the money hungry teacher comes up as a trope there as well. So it's kind of a thing, right? The teacher of virtue who turns out to be very concerned about getting his payment.
Do you
Whereas of
know
course
what?
Socrates
Yeah,
Socrates never asked for payment. He's the ideal.
yeah. I have a soft spot for this argument, though. I really do. Because, I mean, I have to be careful what I say, obviously, because I don't know what I'll do in the future, but I'm not very virtuous, probably. But I agree fundamentally. Um, there's a lot of people out there that look for ways to make money out of these sorts of things, because they're popular. And I know that's a very it's not up to me to kind of condemn people, of course, but in the context of this argument, um, I think it's a fair criticism. I think if philosophy is a way of life and you had the capacity to make a living through other means and you really enjoy talking about philosophy and doing it, then what's stopping you from offering it to people freely because you can and you can support yourself and they might not be able to benefit from it in other ways, especially if you feel like you've got good quality content to offer them that might really help them. Wouldn't it be your duty in a sense?
Yeah, I think so.
I think so too. And I mean, that's why I really love your involvement because I think that you really you kind of epitomize that. You come to these groups, you don't have to be, you know, and you've I think you really help people with this material. So
Oh, thank you, Courtney.
yeah, I mean
I
that.
think you do too.
Yeah, thanks. And I mean, I think we both do. I mean, like I run the Brisbane Stoic thing and it's growing really well. And without going into too much detail about that, I've got plans to grow it further. So, but it will always be free, you know. So, but anyway, I think it's a live issue that.
I think it is.
Um, and of course, it makes sense in the context of this too, because as soon as you charge money, you're you're more open to scrutiny. So if your students aren't participate like behaving like they've gained anything and become actually improved by your philosophical teachings, then at least people can say, oh well, you know, he's just some crazy dude and you should just steer clear of him. But if you're charging them money, well then yeah, that starts to make you look like a fraud or a sophist or whatever.
Yeah.
So mm,
Yeah. And there's a couple of different angles to that too, right? So it makes them look unphilosophical. That's one side of it. But it also, the ordinary parent of, say, Hermotimus or a young student who sees these kind of less than social things going on, like a brawl in public about a payment or, getting drunk and arguing. Those things are likely to, in a sense, give philosophy a bad name, right? Because ordinary people um, to the phenomenon of someone who's charging money to teach philosophy, but isn't walking the walk, is just doing the talking. There's a couple of different sides to it, and that's what we see in section 11 here. Um,
yeah.
there was this is Lycinus is kind of ahead of Hermotimus here because he's seen that there's a sign up on the lecture room saying that there isn't a lecture today, and the reason is that the teacher went to a birthday party the day before and had a fight with the
Mm.
peripatetic, the Aristotelian teacher. And they had went on all not half the night, and there was drinking and yeah, the teacher wasn't fit to do his job the next day.
Yeah. Yeah, he was obviously really drunk and got sick. Yeah.
and but Hermotimus wants to know who won the argument.
Yeah, exactly. And he
Did
says,
the Stoics win? Did his team win?
and it looks like the Stoics did win, right? And Hermotimus says, good. So perish all who will not yield to their betters.
And he's making it like a sporting contest, right? Or it's a team allegiance. Stoics versus the Peripatetics.
Yeah. You can see how this happens, right? We don't interact very much with other schools, but you see it within little groups within Stoicism already, you know? It's definitely the.
Exactly.
And then he says, like Lacanus says, very reasonable Hermotimus. What was Euthydemus thinking of to irritate an old man who is purged of wrath and master of his passions when he had had such a heavy goblet in his hand? So it was almost like Euthydemus was asking for trouble. It definitely wasn't the teacher's fault. He's obviously taking the
That's right.
piss here.
Yeah.
And then we're on to 13. Um, what does he say? You might tell a friend like me the story of your start in philosophy. Oh yeah, he's saying, since you're not going to class, you might as well have a chat to me and tell me how you got into this stuff.
So
Hermotimus
yeah,
says, yeah, if only you would, like Highness. Yeah, he says you might like to join. You will soon find out how much you are superior to the rest of men if you were to become a philosopher, obviously.
yeah. So hey, to just you know, we had a bit of an exchange in our group on in Facebook around, well, what's a superior human? You know, what do we think people who are philosophers are superior? Well, actually, no, we don't. But that's what Hermotimus seems to think. He says, if only you would, Lysinus, you would soon find out how much you are superior to the rest of men.
Mm,
That's if Lysinus were to join his school.
mm,
So, you know, we see and hear another aspect of the whole lifestyle choice. It's a kind of an assumption of superiority for some
mm,
people. Seems to be for Hermotimus. That's what he recommends to
mm.
Lysinus.
Well,
You'll
that's
think them all children. You will be so much wiser.
yeah.
Is that really a good motive for taking up philosophy?
Mm. Another good question too. I mean, it just popped into my head. I wonder what you think. Who calls himself a philosopher these days?
Well, only people who are paid academics, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But back then, these aren't paid academics. Like Hermotimus, I don't think is a paid academic.
No, he's a student.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I think, yeah. But presumably he's aspiring to be like his teacher, an actual teacher of it, because he seems to think his teacher has reached the
Mm.
status required.
Hmm. Because it's interesting when you read Socrates, obviously, like he's not a paid academic either, and he talks about philosophers being lovers of wisdom and not necessarily professional book writers, for example, or historians of ideas, for example. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because the meaning's changed, and nowadays it's almost like if you want to call yourself a psychologist, you have to do a certain course of study, and then you have to do a internship, and then you have to register with the APRA, who is like a regulatory body, and anyone who misuses the term psychologist, for example, can be sued or get in a lot of legal trouble, basically. Is it the same with philosophers, or can anybody call themselves a philosopher? Maybe you
I don't
guys
know,
should
to be honest.
you should go to opera and become like, yeah. What about philosophers? But anyway, all right, moving along then. Um, so if like Heine says, if I'm going to become a philosopher and learn from you guys, do you allow us to criticize if they find difficulties in your doctrines, or must juniors abstain from that? And Hematima says, yeah, yeah, go ahead, ask questions and criticize. That's the best way to learn, isn't it? Bad idea.
And then we get this issue of all these different schools, you know. How do we know which is the right one? Because they
Yeah,
all have different opinions about just about everything.
yeah.
So how did Hermotimus choose the Stoic?
Yes, how did he choose? We never really get to that, do we?
No, I don't think we do ever get an actual account of that. He seems to avoid the question, doesn't he, really?
Yeah. But like Highness is really saying, well, there's all these different schools. They can't all have the truth. I by the truth, but the truth I presume is bound to be in one of them, and not in all as they differ. So he's sort of suggesting here, they can't all have the truth. Maybe it's one of them. So how do you know which one? But later on, he changes it up too. He's like, well, what if none of them have the truth?
That's right.
So he says, then as you love me, answer me this. When you first went into the pursuit of philosophy, you found many gates wide open. What induced you to pass the others by and go for the Stoics? Um, how did you test it? How did you know that wasn't a blind alley? Yeah, how did you know it was the right one? Hermotimus is like, well, I can't tell what you're driving at.
Yeah, he's kind of he's playing a bit dumb here, I think. But
Yeah.
interestingly, I think where Lycinus says, how did you pick out the school? Were you favored like Chaerephon with a revelation from Apollo? That's a direct reference, of course, to Socrates' life, because Chaerephon, Socrates' friend, went off to the oracle at Delphi and said, who was wiser than Socrates? And the oracle said nobody was. So Chaerephon had a clear direction about that, but the rest of us don't usually have that kind of clear direction.
Yeah. I thought it was a good question. It made me think about it because it made me think about things like, well, maybe we already have preconceived ideas and a certain personality, and then we bump into certain philosophical ideas that tend to reinforce or agree with what we already seem to be the case. Because when I talk to people who are very interested in Stoicism, they will often say, well, I felt like it was already telling me something that I already knew, like Chris Fisher told me that, for example. This is the way I've always been. And
Yeah.
for for me, I was a real hedonist, but I'm a freedom-loving hedonist, so I really buy into the freedom aspect. And hedonism had really burnt itself out for me, and I had to look for an alternative because I wasn't doing too well. And this is a great like critique of hedonism as well as and rescuing freedom, from that as a real viable path. My point being, why would I pick Stoicism? Well, yeah, I can see that he's got a good point. I was already had the right predisposition, to kind of look down the alleyway, so to speak, and go, yep, that suits me. That I've already made up my mind before I've even really started to investigate most of the tenets. Were you like that, or was it different for you?
Uh, Yeah, and it's a really good question, I think. And in a sense, people are kind of always gesturing to it when they say, oh, well, how did you come across Stoicism or whatever? So it's kind of like everyone wants an origin story. And that's what Lycinus is trying to get out of Hermotimus. What's your origin story? What actually pointed you in this direction? And he doesn't really get it.
Mm,
But I think personally, years ago when I kind of started looking at the virtue tradition, I sort of thought, yeah, that I like that, and that makes sense to me.
mm,
And then when it was 2020 and the world was changing, and I had at the right time with me Seneca's letters, and it was like, oh yeah, actually this is making even more sense to me now. So yes, I think there was a predisposition. But yeah, it was just that thing at that time that kind of was the catalyst, if you
mm.
like.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. And you're right, it is an origin story, but it's also an admission that, well, you didn't go into it really looking for the truth. You already had made up your mind to some degree, or you were biased, basically. There was a cognitive bias at play. Um, Otherwise, you could have picked one of the other traditions, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
I'm just going to, I notice there's some Latin here in this version. I'm just going to check in my version. I don't think it's in.
oh, I looked up this Latin. Dignus
Oh,
vindice nodus.
yeah, a dignus vindice nodus. A nodus is
Yeah.
a
That
connection worthy of victory.
It turns out it seems to be some sort of common phrase. It means a knot that needs to be untangled by worthy hands, apparently.
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, a knot that's worthy of undoing. Yeah, I guess.
And in a
Okay.
sense, by worthy hands, because here he's saying, was it not the worthy hands that would untangle it, or were you confident in your own unaided discrimination? So, like either some expert or I guess.
Yeah. So here, interestingly, in the Greek, it actually says your own instead of your own unaided discrimination. Actually, it actually says anio to theo, without the God. So without divine guidance, which of course was what Chaerephon had.
Yeah.
So again, I think this translation's lost a little bit of the sense in the Greek.
There you
But
go.
then and I think we're meant to realize that at this point Hermotimus doesn't have much of a clue when he says, well, yes, I was capable of doing that without the god, essentially.
Yeah. And then he says, well, this must be the first lesson from you. He's being very logical. How one can decide out of hand which is the best and true philosophy to be taken and the others left. We've been very lucky too with our group because we sampled Therapy of Desire, which was a bevy of these schools, and it's done in such a way that you could kind of, I think to be honest, that Martha Nussbaum was fairly fair in her presentation of them.
Very, very fair.
Yeah. And so you could read them and go, well, I like that. And I must admit, I found things I liked in all of them, in the
Yeah.
Epicureans, for example.
Well, and in a sense, isn't that brilliant what she was doing, right? So sidebar here, but she was doing what we see in Hermotimus or in Justin Martyr, which is trying out the different schools. That's what she has Nikidian do.
Yeah.
You know, she's following that Hellenistic tradition, as we see, of trying the different schools and finding what suits.
Yeah, great
So
reminder.
clever.
That's right. Because
Yeah.
and at the end of every chapter, it would be what didn't quite make sense to her, was
Yeah.
kind of, yeah. And in fact, we know that Martha Nussbaum is an Aristotelian, but she doesn't have Nikidian taking up Aristotle's peripatetic philosophy, as the solution. She continues to look, and in fact, she finds great confidence or comfort in the Stoic tradition, if I recall. So I don't know what that means, but it seems that Martha is able to write in such a at least unbiased kind of manner, to some degree at least, that she was allowing her character to explore things that maybe she didn't necessarily kind of ascribe to 100% herself, given that
Yeah,
Nikidian, for
absolutely.
example, was a young woman in the ancient world. Maybe that's part of the difference.
Yeah, I think it's an incredible tribute to this ancient tradition.
Mm. Well, and frankly, it was probably one of the few that could possibly accept her. I think that was one of the points she was making, because Nikidian couldn't have been accepted by the Aristotelians because she wasn't an elite male for a start.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but Hermotimus actually admits, he says, well, and this is actually quite interesting. Hermotimus tells us that Stoicism gets the most followers at this time, which is really interesting, right? And then he thought it must be the best. So that's an argument from popularity. But then he didn't even kind of do the math. He just guessed, as it turns out. But also, he's imbibed the mythology around all the propaganda really among all the other schools. The Epicureans are sensual and self-indulgent. The Peripatetics avaricious and contentious. The Platonists conceited and vain. But the Stoics, they have fortitude and an open mind, which is kind of ironic. He doesn't seem to have a very open mind to the others.
Yeah. And he who goes their way, I heard, was the true king and millionaire and wise man, alone and all in one.
Yeah, I'm just going to look at the Greek of that. Oh, yeah, and that shows how naive he is, right? So it says Monos Basilius is the only king, Monos Plusios, the only rich man, Monos Sophos, the only wise man, and everything rolled into one, Sunolos Hapanta. So he's got this idea of Stoicism, the Stoic wise man, as being all these amazing things.
And again, later this comes up in a minute, I think. His feelings about these other schools are incredibly negative. They don't say, oh, well, they've got some good points about this and that. They're just straight up slanderous, pretty much.
That's right. But then where did he get these opinions from? Well, it turns out he just borrowed these opinions from other people anyway. He didn't make his own investigations.
Yeah, and not even their rivals, but from lay people, the common crowd, I guess. And then, of course, Lakinus says, "Well, you're cheating me with your irony. You take me for an idiot. Who will believe that an intelligent person like you, at the age of 40, would accept the word of laymen about philosophy and philosophers and make his own selection on the strength of what they said?" He's got a good point. Hermotimus, for someone who's studied philosophy for a long time, is not very good at philosophy.
No, he's not. But he finds that Hermotimus thought that the Stoics looked better. They had a better appearance. They looked,
Oh, yeah. They're more
manly. They were
manly.
manly. Yep. They behaved, bearing themselves, in fact, like moderate men. Let me see what the Greek is here. Uh, they're not like crazy cynics.
Mm.
What does it say? Halepe to mesu. They would take a middle way, katastematos. Uh, but then he's appealing to what everyone says. It says, and everyone says that is best. Everyone admits that moderation is right. Yeah. So he's appealing to the opinion of the multitude.
Which is interesting, isn't it? Because moderation is often taken as a virtue, but here it's also the opinion of the masses. Did you ever see those Stoics behaving like your master, as I described him just now? Lending money and clamoring for payment, losing their tempers in philosophical debate, making other exhibitions, or perhaps these are trifles so long as the dress is decent, the beard long and the hair close cropped. Yeah. It is by appearance and walk and hair cutting that the best men are to be distinguished, and whosoever has not these marks and is not solemn and thoughtful shall be condemned and rejected. Yeah. So it's typical of all fashion, right? He's just saying, is it a fashion contest at the end of the day? And we definitely see that with those the online contingent, the what do they call them? The influencers and the like, who are borrowing
Yeah.
stoicism.
There's being an admin of a Facebook group now, every day we get posts submitted, which are these ridiculous AI generated muscly Marcuses or Senecas. And yeah, it's all around the appearance. It's just and the videos that go with them are just as silly.
Oh my
It's
God.
ridiculous, but
How do
but it
you
shows
watch them?
how. And I don't. I just project them out of hand. Maybe I should examine them all. But no, yeah, it's so much around appearance. So I think Lysinus is onto something here. There's an aesthetic, right? And it's the aesthetic that it seems to have appealed to Hermotimus.
Yeah, it's the same thing, isn't it? He's saying, well, in Rome at that time, we do value the manly, virtuous looking man, that masculine thing, trope. And that's what we get on the internet now, don't we, with this, what do they call it?
The Broics?
The Broics, yeah. See, it's about muscles and probably material success and being able to reject a partner if you feel like it and all this sort of weirdo stuff, as if
And
it was
having
manly.
having abs, having amazing abs.
And it's in the
That's
context
so.
of reclaiming masculinity because it's been tarnished with this like toxic masculinity or whatever. So they're saying, no, no, no. The ancient Stoics agreed that that's what it meant to be a man. There's nothing
And it's
toxic about
exactly
it.
the same argument, right? That
Yeah,
that
pretty
was
much.
current then.
Yeah, things don't change, eh? Good to know. Um, so yeah, and then what happens? Why do you say that? Says Hermotimus. Um, because, my dear sir, this appearance test is one for statues. Okay. So
Yeah,
when
exactly. They're simulacra. They're not actual people. We've got the AI versions in Lucian. It's the statues. They're
that's
not actual people.
that's it. And he says, what would a blind man do if he wants to take up philosophy? If he can't mimic the right kind of dress and appearance and of the gait, the way that he walks? And he's like, well, I'm not teaching blind people.
Yeah, he's
So
not
he's
concerned
obviously
about that.
catching on that this is not really cool because he's starting to get a little bit like off put,
That's right. But just in the Epictetus we're reading, not last week, but the previous session, I think, or maybe not. Remember, he talks about someone who's got a visual impairment.
Mm.
You know, it's
Mm.
I think maybe even Lucian's appealing to that, right? It's in Epictetus, his point is if someone's got a visual impairment, we don't think any of the worse of them. We make allowances for them, and it's in the context of people who are impaired in their souls and do the wrong thing. But here, you know, Hermotimus doesn't even see that this kind of analogy from someone with a visual impairment. You know, he doesn't see the point of it. He doesn't see that it's
Mm.
a good analogy and it can teach us something. He doesn't get that.
Yeah, and so as a result, it's not a very serious dialogue, is it? Because Hermotimus is very much a hamstrung kind of interlocutor. It's almost as if he's not very familiar with Stoicism at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
He's a foil. Um, and like Aquinas says, yeah, there needs to be some sort of universal criterion. He sounds very much like Socrates or something in this sort of manner. In a matter of such great and general use, still if you will have it so, let blind be excluded from philosophy, as they cannot see, though by the way they are just the people who most need philosophy to console them for their misfortune. Well, he sounds more stoic than Hermotimus
Exactly.
in that regard.
Exactly right.
Um, and then he says, you know, so stop joking around. Was it not from admiration of their spirit that you joined them, expecting to have your spirit purified? And that makes sense. He says, yeah, sure. So how did you know? How could you discern the true philosopher from the false? How did you know that this one was worth following from the marks mentioned?
Yeah, and this interesting little anecdote around Athena, Poseidon, and Hephaestus all making something.
This is a good story, yeah.
It is a good story, and Hephaestus made a person, a man.
Mm.
And the problem with it was, well, he should have made a window in his chest so that when it was open, his thoughts and designs, his truth or falsehood might have been apparent.
That would be really
So,
handy. Why didn't he? I was thinking that. I was like, that's a good idea.
well, yeah, I guess. Um, but so Licinius uses it as the occasion to make a commentary about, well, Hermotimus seems to understand what
Mm.
people are thinking. He says, all is patent to you, not merely any man's wishes and sentiments, but the comparative merits of any pair.
Yeah.
And Hermotimus has got a bit of an idea that he's being laughed at here. He says, I made a pious choice and do not repent it. That is enough for me.
Yeah. It starts to look like religion at this point, doesn't it? And
Yeah,
then
exactly.
and I read that this Lucian of Samosata is in his satires, he wrote a lot apparently, and he was often taking the piss out of religion and superstition and magical practices and stuff like that. So he seems to be lumping these philosophies into that whole kind of general kind of superstitious way of seeing the world,
Well,
maybe.
yes and no. I mean, I think well, one view it is that he's not attacking philosophy as such, but rather the way that a lot of people go about it. I would say that's more
Mm.
the subject of it.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. Yeah. In a way, though, he's kind of attacking all other philosophers, all of the philosophical schools. He makes that clear, not just the Stoics, but all of them. Um,
Well, he is, but by implication, if you think about it, so the things he attacks are, you know, the fact that studying philosophy doesn't seem to improve the character of these people. They take money and get obsessed with that.
mm,
If you think about Socrates, well, he didn't take money, and his character wasn't impaired by. Well, he was a good character, so I think like Lucian Licinus would accept there is an ideal. It's just that most of the practitioners don't live up to it.
Maybe, I'm not sure, because he says all the different people who practice these things, as we're going to discover, some of them are better at it than others, and you've got to go and investigate each one of them, which leads to a kind of reductio absurdum, or whatever you call it. So at the end of the day, it's an impossible task to kind of pursue this kind of philosophy, as in a philosophy that aims towards some sort of progression or something like that. But anyway,
Yeah.
that's an interesting point. I'll have to think about it. Um, and I think that's why, just before we leave that subject, why skepticism does come off not really looking exactly like the other schools, because the other schools make dogmatic claims, and the skeptics don't really, do they? If they make a
Yeah,
dogmatic
that's right.
claim, it's just that you can't, you have to withhold judgment because you can't know
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, I tend to think if if Lycinus/Lucian has got an allegiance or a propensity towards any of the groups, I think it's more to cynicism, right? Because
Really?
and so yeah, I think so.
You mean
You
he?
know,
Oh, okay.
it's an uncompromising kind of position. So yeah, I'd say I'd put him more in the cynic school than the skeptical
Really?
school. Yeah,
Oh, that's really funny. I don't know. Because he makes this really odd claim towards the end. He says, because I was thinking the Stoics, one of the brilliant things that makes Stoicism interesting from a psychological point of view is how they hunt out inconsistency. So they will obviously say, well, you say you want X, you say that you're motivated by X, however, you're behaving in a contrary way. Don't you see it? And then you expose the contradiction, and the person is therefore forced to live in a more coherent way. They can't, human beings can't abide this contradiction. But he makes a point in here saying that all of the schools do this just because they start from a point of view. They lure you into a perspective that, once you agree the initial setup, the initial principles, it becomes consistent on the basis of that initial setup. So it's
yeah,
no
yeah.
wonder that it appears consistent throughout. And so cynicism doesn't have, would still fall into that, doing that. It starts off with a very
Uh,
strong set of principles that remain consistent throughout. I think it would still fall for that critique strongly.
maybe. But you see, this is another aspect of it, which occurred to me when I was reading this. If you adopt Stoicism, you're also adopting elements of Platonism. If you adopt the Peripatetic school, you're adopting elements of Platonism.
Yeah.
If you adopt the Stoic school, you're adopting elements of cynicism. So I think the schools weren't mutually exclusive in some senses, even though they were formerly
Hmm.
rivals. They actually shared a lot of common ground. And so I think that might be part of the solution to the
Good
dilemma.
point.
One of the dilemmas in this dialogue is the fact that we'll actually know, despite kind of rivalries on some fronts, there are a lot of identities on other fronts.
That's a good point, because I'm not, you might be right, because we could say that he has a problem with dogmatic claims, and I think that could be true, because all the philosophical schools are making strong dogmatic claims throughout. But he does say that, you should give up philosophy and just become like the normal people, the common crowd. But I remember from Therapy of Desire that the skeptics even thought that the common crowd basically were making dogmatic claims about what it meant to be, to have common sense, for example. So maybe you're right, because he doesn't seem to have a problem, at least here, with the opinions of the common crowd. But anyway, no, really good question. Not sure. There you go. What were we up to?
Okay, so Lycinus is going to give an account of what he thinks virtue is, or
Yeah.
virtuous people.
Are we at 22?
Yep.
Well, it makes sense too, right? He conceived of virtue as under the figure of a state whose citizens are happy, as your professor, who is one of them, phrases it. Absolutely wise, all of them brave, just, and self-controlled, hardly distinguishable, in fact, from gods. And all the kind of
So this
negative
is yeah,
things.
this is kind of an ideal state, a state
Hmm.
of virtuous people, which I guess is Zeno's Republic,
Hmm.
or Plato's Republic. It's a kind of utopian state, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not very realistic.
And they live in peace and harmony. And yeah, everyone's happy. Gold pledges distinctions they never regard as objects of dispute. They're not interested in them. They have banished them long ago as undesirable elements. Their life is serene and blissful in the enjoyment of legality, equality, liberty, and all the other good things. Hermotinus is like, yeah, well, like Highness, must not all men yearn to belong to a state like that and never count the toil of getting there, nor lose heart over the time it takes? Because it's such a beautiful kind of idea. But
Yeah,
like Highness goes on to say that he's you're right. What did he say? We should devote all our efforts to this and neglect everything else. I think, but he's taking the piss again, right, isn't he? Because he says,
I think he is. Yeah,
yeah, we should steel our hearts against the clingings and cryings of children or parents if we have them, and if they grab hold of you, and then you should throw off your coat, basically, and keep marching towards that goal. Like he's saying that desire that the students of philosophy have is a rejection of ordinary human life.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I'll tell you what this reminded me of. It's in well, it's in the New Testament. Doesn't Jesus say
Oh
to
yeah,
the young man who what's, how do I follow you? And Jesus says, well, cast off your family,
yeah,
essentially. It's like, oh, okay.
and let the dead bury
It's
the
a
dead.
Yeah, don't go off and organize the funeral for your father. Follow me.
Mm,
It's a kind of it's a very countercultural message, but Lucian's uh, pinning it down. He's stating it like it is. If that's Zeno's
mm.
ideal republic, that's what you're committing yourself to.
Yeah, and I did even think reading this of, what would happen for hundreds of years following with the monasteries, young men living these very unnatural lives. Like that movie, or it was a book originally by Umberto Eco, The Name of the Rose. I mean,
Yeah,
God, that went on for hundreds of years. Like,
yeah, and for women as well. So yeah, I mean, we do tend to forget that. Yep, that was the way of life for thousands upon thousands of people for 1,500 years.
man, we're so fortunate.
So yeah, but yeah, that I mean, in a sense, that was a kind of a um, well, it was a kind of a little republic. Every monastery with nobody having any possessions. I mean, that's part of
Yeah,
it. Everyone gave up their worldly identity and their possessions when they entered into it. So in a sense, it was a philosophical community.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, is that a really good way to spend a life? You know?
Well, you do wonder. That's right. And
Or is it, what I think the Stoics would actually advocate for is a deeply fulfilling life spent in service to one another in a kind of political and public life,
yeah, well,
in a
or a
community.
family. I mean, yeah, in a sense that the um the monastic model borrows far more, I would say, from the Epicurean garden.
Mm,
We discussed this when we were reading Nussbaum.
yeah.
It's far more the Epicurean model than it is the Stoic model.
I see the Stoics as very much having a yes to life, that whatever comes along is kind of given to you, and so political life can be, yeah, it's just part of life. It's what you've been given. It's yeah, and seems so healthy and natural when you think about it that way. But anyway, apparently these students didn't know that. Um, So what does he say here? Oh, he's saying about the people who become enlightened through philosophy, if this is how I understood it. Among the noteworthy things that this guy has learnt, seem to remember that all the citizens in this utopia are aliens and foreigners, not a native among them. They include numbers of barbarians, slaves, cripples, dwarfs, and poor. In fact, anyone is admitted, for their law does not associate the franchise with income, with shape, size, or beauty, with old or brilliant ancestry. These things are not considered at all. Anyone who would be a citizen needs only understanding, zeal for the right energy, perseverance, fortitude, and resolution in facing all the trials on the road of the road. Whoever proves his possession of these by persisting till he reaches the city is ipso facto a full citizen, regardless of his antecedents. Such
It's
distinctions.
beautiful. It's a beautiful
Mm,
sketch of the true Stoic democracy in a sense. You know, this is what
mm.
and in a sense, I think he's actually, for a moment, he's not satirizing the Stoic ideal in a sense. I think he's presenting it as revolutionary as it is. You know, it's a true democracy. It's not a it's not an aristocracy of income, descent, or beauty, and everyone takes part as long as they're committed to doing the right thing. It's actually a great statement of the Stoic ideal.
But interestingly, everyone is a foreigner, not a
Yeah,
native among them. Like, I mean,
yeah,
if he's coming from a point of nationalism, he's saying it's all outsiders, isn't he? Maybe.
yeah. It's and he actually says, well, um, and Hermotima says, I yearn to be counted among the citizens of that fair and happy state. And Lycinus says, well, he feels the same.
Yeah, yeah. He would have.
So in a sense, they're saying that this ideal is so attractive, you know, it draws people in.
I think there's something really clever too about this attraction. What draws you in is, you get a hint of this in, I don't know, Therapy of Desire kind of talked about Epicurus's kind of understanding of people's unconscious forces and desire for love and unity and things like that. And I think this is where he kind of goes for. He's like, you desire love, you desire to be the
Yeah.
attractiveness of it, and once that,
Community.
yeah,
Yeah.
once that hooks you, then you most of the work's been done. You've been sold something on the basis of, he doesn't say unconscious, but an unconscious desire, basically. Maybe that's one way of looking at it.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're right. And he points out that, well, every school, every community can hold out an attractive prospect like this. Um, there my difficulty lies. Whichever of them I try, they're sure to be a most respectable person, stationed at the entrance with a welcoming hand and exhortation.
Hmm.
And then so does the next group of people or group of
Yep.
philosophers or seekers after truth.
Yeah, and they all say the same thing. Yep. And he's like, so how do you decide which one to go down, which path to follow? He says, I can solve that puzzle for you. You cannot go wrong if you trust those who have been already. And Laconicus, which do you mean? Those who have been by which road and under whose guidance? It is the old puzzle in a new form. You've only substituted men for measures. How do you mean? Laconicus says, why, the man who has taken Plato's road and traveled with him will recommend that road. So with Epicurus and the rest, and you will recommend your own. How else, Hermotimus? It must be so. Yeah, makes sense, doesn't it? And then they go into this interesting metaphor of looking for Corinth.
Yeah,
And he says, just to summarize it, um, so you get a guide. He now recommends and will have to be the only one leading to the city, the road. Whether he tells the truth, I have no means of knowing that he has attained some end and seen some city. I can allow that, but whether he saw the right one or whether Corinth being the real goal, he got to Babylon and thought he had seen Corinth. That is still undecided. For surely everyone who has seen a city has not seen Corinth, unless Corinth is the only city there is. But my greatest difficulty of all is the absolute certainty that the true road is one, for Corinth is one, and the other roads lead anywhere but to Corinth. Though there may be people deluded enough to suppose that the North Road and the South Road lead equally to Corinth. So this is quite it's a plausible kind of way of putting it. But
Yeah.
Hermogenes says that's absurd, like highness. They go opposite ways, you see.
Yeah. But it is a serious point, because if you think about, well, this whole issue of guidance, what is our guide? I mean, these days when we have so many uh, pieces or sources of information at our disposal about how to get from A to B, maybe we lose the strength, lose the force of this analogy a little bit.
Mm.
But you only have to be somewhere where you've never been before, and you're absolutely clueless. I mean, you literally have no idea.
Well, yeah, and that question of measure, are we talking apples and apples or apples and oranges? Like, is where ultimately happiness, I think that's what they're talking about. But does this guide mean happiness? Like this other guide means happiness? Are they talking about the same happiness? That's like Corinth and some other city, you know?
Yeah,
Are
yeah.
they
Well,
able to
Babylon.
distinguish between them?
That's right. Yeah. So it's not only the path, it's the destination that the disagreement's about.
Yeah. Um, and then there's the problem of blundering onto the wrong road. He says here that uh, once you start down the wrong road, you might have trouble getting back. He said, "Here's an illustration. It's no easy matter to turn back and get safe into port when you've once cast loose your moorings and committed yourself to the breeze. You're at the mercy of the sea, frightened, sick, and sorry with your tossing about, most likely. Your mistake was at the beginning, before leaving. You should have gone up to some high point and observed whether the wind was in the right quarter and of the right strength for a crossing to Corinth, not neglecting, by the way, to secure the very best pilot obtainable and a seaworthy craft equal to so high a sea." Good point, right? Because we stumble into these things. He's saying we should really withdraw before we throw ourselves into these things and go and very discriminate. We have to learn how to be very careful about the decisions we make before we embark on a journey, like choosing a philosophical path, perhaps.
Yeah. But Hermotimus just says again, well, look, if you go the whole round, you'll find no better guides or more expert paths than the Stoics.
Mm.
It's the only way to do it.
Yep. But Plato's fellow traveler, Epicurus's follower, and all the rest, they'll just say exactly the same thing, won't they?
That's right.
So
And
what?
he in 30, he gestures to this uh,
Oh yeah, this
a
bit.
sort of powerful argument, which is of course often deployed, which is around again origins. What possessed you or induced you to exalt Chrysippus and Zeno? We are far older established. So Plato, Pythagoras, Aristotle are far earlier, or not far, but a bit earlier.
Mm.
And so this question of authenticity comes to bear. Who's the most authoritative because of their priority in time?
Yes, that's right. We are far older. He has them doing an imaginary kind of cross-examination. How dare you not choose us? We're older. These guys, the Stoics, are mere creatures of yesterday. Yet you never gave us a hearing nor inquired into our statements at all. Um, well, what am I to plead? Will it avail me to say I trusted my friend Hermotimus? It sounds a bit flimsy, doesn't it? I feel sure they
That's
will
right.
say, "We don't know this Hermotimus. Who is he? Nor he us. You had no right to condemn us all and give judgment by default against us on the authority of a man who knew only one of the philosophic roads, and even that perhaps imperfectly. These are not the instructions issued to juries, like highness. They are not they're not to hear one party and refuse the other permission to say what he deems advisable. They have to hear both sides of the argument and sift the truth from falsehood by comparison of the arguments. If they fail in these duties, the law allows an appeal to another court. And it makes sense, right? That's not a bad argument. If they were to cross-examine him, they would say, "Well, you're being very biased in your presentation here."
That's right. And so in 31, we kind of get an argument, well, someone who'd never seen
Yeah,
Caucasian men would decide, well, actually, no, they didn't exist.
yeah.
And so what do you think then? What's the next step in the argument? It's, well, Hermotimus hasn't traveled in Plato's country or to Epicurus. And so he's like the person from Ethiopia who's never been anywhere except Ethiopia. And Hermotimus, Hermotimus says, it is indeed the Stoic doctrine that we study fully, being minded to sink or swim with that, but still we do know what the others say also. Our teacher rehearses the articles of their beliefs to us, incidentally, and demolishes them with his comments.
Yeah, and this reminds me of the little joke you and I have had in the past, because I often will say, "Oh, isn't that funny? Epictetus makes a real scathing attack of the skeptics, like they can't find their mouth with a spoon or whatever." And you appropriately say, "Well, it's not very fair, is it? It's a bit of a straw man." And that's exactly the point that Lakinus makes here, is that they're sort of shadow boxing. They're erecting these very easy to take down targets and then feeling good about themselves for having bested straw targets or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
And he has some great imagery in here, doesn't he? He says, um, "Do not let Hermotimus suppose from his teacher's sparrings with our shadows, for we're not there, that they have had the victory, or that our doctrines are so easily upset. Tell him the business is too like the sand houses which children, having built them weak, have no difficulty in overturning. Or to change the figure like people practicing archery. They make a straw target, hang it to a post planted a little way off, and then let fly at it. If they hit and get through the straw, they burst into a shout, as if it were a great triumph to have driven through the dry stuff." It's pretty good.
Yeah, but
I think it's
it's
well
great.
written.
It is well written. But he compares, the Persians or Scythian archers, they practice on moving targets. They're doing something far more challenging. So, but Hermotimus is saying that his teachers only dispose of straw targets.
Mm. And he gives this great quote from Achilles' words against Hector: "They dare not face the nodding of my plume."
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if that's exactly true. From what I've heard, they would often face each other in debate, right? But there you go.
Yeah, exactly. And then this is again another interesting anecdote. Gello of
Oh yeah.
Syracuse, one of um,
Have you
and
heard this
so
before? Just out of
no,
interest,
this
though.
was new to me. Um, and apparently, and oh yeah, and Lycia says that Plato, because Plato had been in Sicily, would know this story.
Mm.
And so this about the foreign woman who had a connection with him, obviously was his mistress,
Yeah.
told him that he had bad breath, but he was upset with his wife because um, she'd never told him that he had bad breath. But she had never been in with any other man, so she thought all men would have had bad breath. So this is a pretty kind of damning analogy for Hermotimus and the Stoics.
Yeah. It's an interesting one,
uh,
isn't it? But
yeah,
again,
it
I
is.
think it's really good advice to people interested even today in philosophy, is that you might be really interested in Stoicism, but definitely go and learn about the other schools, I
Yeah.
think
And again, that's where Nussbaum's so great because she gives you this potted approach to all the, well, does she do
mm,
the peripatetics? Oh, she does. Yeah,
she
yeah.
did, yeah.
Yeah.
And
She
the
gives this
skeptics.
potted and the skeptics, yeah. So it's like a little course in all the different schools. so you can try them and see whether it suits you.
And if you're a fan of Sellers, he released a little book on Aristotle recently, which I got sitting on the shelf. I haven't read yet.
Yeah, no, I haven't read it either. Yeah, I'll have a look.
Hmm. Okay, for heaven's sake, Lacanus, let us leave Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, and the rest of them alone. To argue with them is not for me. This is a private inquiry, he says after that. Okay, we'll get rid of them. We don't need to talk about them, basically, Lacanus says. Well, it seems to me perfectly possible, Lacanus, after studying the Stoic doctrines alone, to get at the truth from them, without going through a course of all the others too. Look at it this way. If someone tells you simply 2 times 2 is 4, need you go around all the mathematicians to find out whether there is one who makes it 5 or 7, or would you know at once that the man was right? And of course, Lacanus is able to turn this on its head too, isn't he? Because he says, um, did you ever meet a man who said twice 2 was 7 or 11? No. I or anyone who did not make 4 of it must be mad. But on the other hand, try to tell the truth, I adjure you. Did you ever meet a Stoic and Epicurean who did not differ about principles or ends?
Yeah.
No.
So while everyone agrees that 2 times 2 is 4, the Stoics and Epicureans disagree about a whole lot of other stuff.
So they don't have starting principles that line up. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. It's not the same kind of
Yeah.
intuitive knowledge.
Yeah. I was going to say something else about that, but I forgot. What were we saying? Stoic doctrines. Oh, yeah. One thing I was thinking about as I was going through this that he didn't really go into is I think it is a plausible argument, because he's saying you really got to know all of them in great detail and all of that. But don't you get the impression that when you look at a school of philosophy or a type of philosophy or religion for that matter, pretty soon you can come across some aspect of their doctrine that you just find indefensible or just obnoxious or something like that,
Yeah.
which is good enough for you to then go, well, I've exhausted that because I know I couldn't possibly build that into my worldview. But
Yeah,
this is
for
not
sure.
something that Laquinus kind of seems to pay attention to. He actually he gets rid of it by saying, well, you can't appreciate the whole from examining the parts alone. I think that's his way
That's
out of that
true.
one.
Yeah. Yeah. He doesn't really address the issue of prior commitments, does he? Because he, in a sense, he doesn't even get to that point because Hermotimus doesn't even acknowledge the issue of uh, grounds for a choice, which would be an indicator for prior commitments.
Hmm. And I guess an interesting thing and a kind of personal thing is, are there things in Stoicism that you find repugnant enough that you would want to remove them? Like personally, I haven't found anything like that. There's nothing really that strikes me as being particularly obnoxious, any part of the doctrine that I'd want to, that I can think that I would get rid of off the top of my head. But it does kind of what's the word, account for why some modern Stoics might like to get rid of providence, for example, or they
Yeah.
might like to try and get rid of um, determinism, or they might
Yeah.
try to get rid of these kind of more uh, complex ideas around fate, for example, or the conflagration.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think you're right that many people find there are sticking points which either make them discard the system or as a whole or attempt to carve out those things they don't like and commit to other elements.
Hmm.
But yeah, that didn't seem to be an option as far as we can see uh, for people in Hermotimus's position.
And I think you'll often find in the more traditional modern groups, the people's claims will be something like, and I'm speaking for them, so it's a bit inappropriate, but they might say something like, well, if you don't like that stuff, then why not become a X, Y, or Z, something different? Why not call yourself a, I don't know, what do they say?
Yeah, yeah, but I think those debates probably took place. Uh, yeah, I would say that they did take place, but I don't think they actually get a run in
And another
this
thing
dialogue.
that's strongly made here, and maybe this is a feature of ancient philosophy, is that only one of these schools can possibly have the truth.
Yeah,
Um, I'm not troubled by that. Um, and and I don't know if that makes me less orthodox or even if that matters. But I think it's an interesting question because I think if I recall, Pierre Hadot makes the kind of observation that Epicureanism and Stoicism are just different existential themes as it comes to philosophy as a way of life. He made that point in his book Philosophy as a Way of Life that the Stoic is about attention and vigilance and that tension that comes with that. And the Epicurean is around relaxation. It's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. But he sees them all as viable kind of options, different themes of what did he call it? Existential themes, different existential themes, and they can have very different kind of shapes or
yeah,
expressions, but they're getting towards the same kind of ultimate idea, presumably. I don't know. What do you think about that? What
yeah, yeah. No, I think that's a good take, and I think it's also Nussbaum's take in a sense because she can see the intuitively compelling aspects of of each different school in turn. Uh, so yeah, I think that's a well, I think that's what's at the heart of this dialogue in a sense is Lucian's trying to explore, well, why would you commit to one school or another? What is it about
mm,
them that that directs that choice or should direct that choice?
mm,
And I'm not sure that he reaches really a conclusion on that.
mm,
And maybe he's not, and he um so yeah, I think that's perfectly consistent with that Ado perspective you mentioned, and with Nussbaum's sort of balanced and fair presentation of all the schools. I think, um,
yeah, I think so. I think, and this is a maybe like kindness is really saying, and this I can get behind. He's saying, don't be a dogmatist,
yeah, yeah. I mean, well,
which
yeah,
is,
maybe that's part of the message behind this. Although I'm not sure that he wouldn't. So I mean, say for instance, you had someone who could argue much more competently than Hermotimus seems to be able to do. Someone who had a reasoned, it could give a reasoned account for his choice of a one particular school. I think Lucian would be fine with that. You know, it's partly the unthinking adoption or the apparently reasonless adoption of a school that he's objecting to, not the allegiance in
yeah,
itself, but the original decision.
yeah, especially against the backdrop of how the man's actually living his life.
Exactly.
Um, okay, so what comes next? Do 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 do. I think they were talking about the twice two thing. He goes on about that a little bit. If it is once established that Stoics have the monopoly of making four out of twice two, it is time for the rest to hold their tongues. But as long as they refuse to yield that point, we must hear all alike or be prepared for people's calling us partial judges. Yeah, so more on that. Okay. But then
This was a
her,
really really fun kind of thought experiment, wasn't it? So, yeah, going into the temple and there's a valuable piece of
Oh
hardware
yeah.
missing.
Yeah, this is quite interesting. I didn't know what to make of it at the beginning. I thought this is not a very good analogy, but then I got really caught up in the imagery of it.
I think it's great. There's two people who go into the temple,
Yeah.
and then afterwards they find out, well, one of the beautiful chalices or cups of the sacred libations is missing. So who's going to be searched? Everyone's going to be searched.
Mm-hmm.
If you find it the first person, you don't have to strip the other person. Um, but then maybe, well, then everyone's got a different account. Somebody says it was this, somebody says it was that. Nobody's even sure what it's made of.
Well, yeah, to
And this
make
is where we
things
find
worse, there's more than two people. There could be lots of people.
exactly. Yeah, there's been, dozens of visitors during the day. Everyone gives a different account of the missing item. And that's where we find ourselves in choosing a school, because everything's different. There's all these different accounts.
Yeah,
There's no kind of shared criterion.
that's right. The measure is all different. And it's
Yeah,
very, it's ironic, really, because both Epictetus and Socrates spend quite a bit of, well, they put a lot of emphasis on having good criteria, on having a measure that works. And this is classic skepticism, is that they have a word, I can't remember what the Greek word was, but it was in Nussbaum, and she talks about how one of the skeptic attacks was that any assertion could equally be argued in the opposite direction. And this is what he puts to good use here, right?
yeah. There turn out to be so many variables. It's not even sure what the item was,
Mm-hmm.
whether it was a cup, was it gold? So then everyone has to be strip searched.
That's it.
Um,
Because obviously for most of these schools, the good is one thing. But these guys can take the opposite position and say, well, how do we know? The good
that's right.
is one thing to you, but to the next person, it's a completely different thing. So the good is multiple different things. And who can agree
Exactly.
upon it?
Yeah. And I actually thought this second analogy was also really interesting. How the
Yeah.
draw at an athletic festival was organized. There's a draw.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an
Uh,
interesting. I thought you would have liked that because it's a bit of history, right?
Bit of history, that's right. So there's two lots marked alpha, two marked beta, two
Yeah.
gamma, and so on. Um, and then what if you've got an odd number of competitors? Well, then you get one that's marked with one different letter.
Yeah. But then like what's his name? Forgot already. What's the other fella's name?
Lacinus.
Lycinus. He goes and makes it complicated again. He's like, yeah, yeah, yeah,
That's
but
right.
you're just assuming that it's done the way it's done in
Yeah, in
Olympus.
alphabetical order. Well,
Yeah.
how about if
What
the
if it
symbols were
wasn't?
chosen at random? Yeah, exactly.
What if it was dog heads and
That's
camels?
right. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting.
And so it means that you'd have to go through every single person before you were able to deduce
Yeah, yeah,
which one wasn't a
that's right.
pair.
And the whole thrust of these elaborate examples is to identify how many variables there are between the different schools and their different views about so many different things.
Mm.
So how are you to establish what's the correct approach?
Yep. Yeah,
Um,
and that's what he explains right here, actually. So there's the dogs and the lions and stuff.
yeah. So yeah, how are we going to choose between all the doctrines of Chrysippus, Plato, Aristotle, and Epicurus?
And then there's this interesting thing about like here he says was about being acquainted with things. He says here,
Oh yeah,
consequently, if we mean to find either the man who has the sacred cup or the buy, or our best guide to the famous city of Corinth, we must absolutely go to and examine them all, trying and carefully stripping and comparing them the truth will be hard enough to find. Even so, if I am to take anyone's advice upon the right philosophy to choose, I insist upon his knowing what they will say. Everyone else I disqualify. I will not trust him while there is one philosophy he is unacquainted with. That one may possibly be the best of all. If someone were to produce a handsome man and state that he was the handsomest of mankind, we would not accept that unless we knew that he had seen all men. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It might be a good place to kind of, I mean, I don't think we're going to get through much further tonight, Courtney. I'm just
No, we're
thinking
not.
it's a long dialogue, so can we continue it maybe next time?
Yeah.
But
So
yeah, so can you just want to go up back a tiny bit?
yeah.
Yeah, so at the end of 45, there's actually a reference, of course, to Platonism there. Now, if we're looking not simply for beauty, but for the greatest beauty, and if we miss that, we shall account ourselves no further than we were. We should not be content with chancing upon some sort of beauty. We're in search of a definite thing, the supreme beauty,
Yeah.
which must necessarily be one. So yeah, there's a reference to Plato's theory about the form of beauty, and also I suspect to do with who was it who talks about the one? Is it Parmenides? I think it's Parmenides.
Not Morpheus from the Matrix.
Maybe. But yeah, I think this is a reference to, and this is establishing Lycinus's credentials as to know what he's talking about, because he's giving a clear reference here to Platonism.
And also it links well with the handsome man thing, because how would you know it's the one if you haven't gone out there and looked at every single other beautiful thing that everyone else is talking about? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're at 46. We might as well wrap it up. I don't know. We don't have to come back to this one in a fortnight. If you want, we can do it down the track.
Oh no,
It's up to you.
I'm really enjoying it. I mean, I'd love to do it the second
Okay.
session on. Is that all right?
Yeah, I'm really liking it. No, that suits me down to the ground. Well, great. Well, I really enjoyed this. I know it's only the two of us, but it's really quite nice to work through this one with you. It's fun. So are you happy? We'll call it a night then.
So yeah, we'll take it up at 47 next time.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much, Judith. It's fun as always, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. Same. We'll see you again.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.